Finally, since any ending is a kind of beginning of the next phase, it is often wise strategy to end on an ambivalent note. If you are reconciling with an enemy after a fight, subtly hint that you still have a residue of doubt, that the other side must still prove itself to you. When a campaign or project comes to an end, leave people feeling that they cannot foresee what you will do next. Keep them in suspense, toying with their attention. By ending on a note of mystery and ambiguity, a mixed signal, an insinuating comment, a touch of doubt, you gain the upper hand for the next round in a most subtle and insidious fashion. Reversal. There can be no value in ending anything badly. There is no reversal. Here are further reflections on the exit strategy. From the I Ching. If one overshoots the goal, one cannot hit it. If a bird will not come to its nest but flies higher and higher, it eventually falls into the hunter's net. He who in times of extraordinary salience of small things does not know how to call a halt, but restlessly seeks to press on, draws upon himself misfortune at the hands of gods and men, because he deviates from the order of nature. By Tacitus. They create desolation and call it peace. From All's Well That Ends Well, by William Shakespeare. All's well that ends well, still the find's the crown. Whate'er the course, the end is the renown. From The Great Arab Conquests, by John Bagot Glubb. 10,000 Muslims then marched through the mountain valleys upon Mecca. Muhammad divided his force into 4 columns. Muhammad gave strict orders that no violence was to be used. His own tent was pitched on high ground immediately overlooking the town. 8 years before, he had fled from Mecca under cover of darkness and lain hidden 3 days in a cave on Mount Thor, which from his tent he could now see rising beyond the city. Now 10,000 warriors were ready to obey his least command, and his native town lay helpless at his feet. After a brief rest, he remounted his camel and entered the town, reverently touched the black stone, and performed the 7 ritual circuits of the Kaaba. Muhammad the Conqueror was not vindictive. A general amnesty was proclaimed, from which less than a dozen persons were excluded, only 4 being actually executed. Ikrimah, the son of Abu Jahal, escaped to the Yemen, but his wife appealed to the apostle, who agreed to forgive him. The Muslim occupation of Mecca was thus virtually bloodless. The fiery Khalid ibn al-Walid killed a few people at the southern gate and was sharply reprimanded by Muhammad for doing so. Although the apostle had himself been persecuted in the city, and although many of his bitterest opponents were still living there, he won all hearts by his clemency on his day of triumph. Such generosity, or statesmanship, was particularly remarkable among Arabs, a race to whom revenge has always been dear. His success had been won by policy and diplomacy rather than by military action. In an age of violence and bloodshed, he had realized that ideas are more powerful than force. By Ovid. Either don't attempt it, or carry it through to the end. From Strategy, by B.H. Little Hart. Indeed, deepening study of past experience leads to the conclusion that nations might often have come nearer to their object by taking advantage of a lull in the struggle to discuss a settlement than by pursuing the war with the aim of victory. History reveals also that in many cases a beneficial peace could have been obtained if the statesmen of the warring nations had shown more understanding of the elements of psychology in their peace feelers. Their attitude has commonly been too akin to that seen in the typical domestic quarrel. Each party is afraid to appear yielding, with the result that when one of them shows any inclination toward conciliation, this is usually expressed in language that is too stiff, while the other is apt to be slow to respond, partly from pride or obstinacy, and partly from a tendency to interpret such a gesture as a sign of weakening, when it may be a sign of returning common sense. Thus, the fateful moment passes, and conflict continues, to the common damage. Rarely does a continuation serve any good purpose where the two parties are bound to go on living under the same roof. This applies even more to modern war than to domestic conflict, since the industrialization of nations has made their fortunes inseparable. From Strategy by B.H. Littlehart. If you concentrate exclusively on victory, with no thought for the after effect, you may be too exhausted to profit by the peace, while it is almost certain that the peace will be a bad one, containing the germs of another war. This is a lesson supported by abundant experience. From On War by Karl von Clausewitz. It is even possible that the attacker, reinforced by the psychological forces peculiar to attack, will, in spite of his exhaustion, find it less difficult to go on than to stop, like a horse pulling a load uphill. We believe that this demonstrates without inconsistency how an attacker can overshoot the point at which, if he stopped and assumed the defensive, there would still be a chance of success, that is, of equilibrium. It is therefore important to calculate this point correctly when planning the campaign. An attacker may otherwise take on more than he can manage, and as it were get into debt. A defender must be able to recognize this error if the enemy commits it, and exploit it to the full. In reviewing the whole array of factors a general must weigh before making his decision, we must remember that he can gauge the direction and value of the most important ones only by considering numerous other possibilities, some immediate, some remote. He must guess, so to speak. Guess whether the first shock of battle will steel the enemy's resolve and stiffen his resistance, or whether, like a Bologna flask, it will shatter as soon as its surface is scratched. Guess the extent of debilitation and paralysis that the drying up of the particular sources of supply and the severing of certain lines of communication will cause in the enemy. Guess whether the burning pain of the injury he has been dealt will make the enemy collapse with exhaustion, or, like a wounded bull, arouse his rage. Guess whether the other powers will be frightened or indignant, and whether and which political alliances will be dissolved or formed. When we realize that he must hit upon all this and much more by means of his discreet judgment, as a marksman hits a target, we must admit that such an accomplishment of the human mind is no small achievement. Thousands of wrong turns running in all directions tempt his perception. And if the range, confusion, and complexity of the issues are not enough to overwhelm him, the dangers and responsibilities may. This is why the great majority of generals will prefer to stop well short of their objective, rather than risk approaching it too closely, and why those with high courage and an enterprising spirit will often overshoot it, and so fail to attain their purpose. Only the man who can achieve great results with limited means has really hit the mark. From The Mind of War by Grant T. Hammond. The great prize fighter Jack Dempsey was once asked, "When you are about to hit a man, do you aim for his chin or his nose?" "Neither," Dempsey replied. "I aim for the back of his head." From the I Ching. Victory seems to have been achieved. There remains merely a remnant of the evil, resolutely to be eradicated as the time demands. Everything looks easy. Just there, however, lies the danger. If we are not on guard, evil will succeed in escaping by means of concealment,